So Deborah has set me up with basically an impossible task, which is to somehow in about 20 minutes tell you about the future of invention. And since I'm grossly unqualified to tell you about that, I'm going to take on a related, almost as difficult, but slightly more tractable problem, which is I'm going to try to get from a story about windmills in Malawi to a story about revolution in Egypt within about 18 minutes. And the way that I'm going to do it is by way of this guy. This guy's a guy named Erich von Hippel. He's a professor at MIT, and he studies a very particular form of innovation. Von Hippel isn't so much interested in the sorts of innovation that takes place in a lab with huge amounts of budgets and lab equipment. He's really interested in the way that people who use products innovate. And when he started his work, he was looking at laboratory scientists, and he was looking at the ways in which people would get laboratory equipment and they would hack it over time. They would find ways to adapt it for their own purposes, and they would end up in the process creating new products. And in many industries, something like 70 to 80% of lab technology ends up being developed and innovated by the folks in the lab who are hacking someone else's products. And so Eric started wondering, how common is this? Is this just lead users, sort of folks who are pushing technology into really extreme directions, or does this happen all the time? And he just did a study with the University of Brighton in the UK where they went out and did a very, very broad survey of people in Britain to say, have you invented anything? Have you taken someone else's product? Have you improved it? Have you somehow changed it? And they get these amazing stories back. They found a guy who had taken apart his washing machine and had figured out, or I think it was his clothes dryer, and had figured out how to short it out so he just got a spin cycle out of it. So he got a little bit of the water out and then was able to put things on a clothesline and use less energy. Found a guy who had modified a fishing pole so that he could reach up into a tree, pull it down, trim the bushes, and sort of go back and forth. And when you broaden out invention to include these sorts of small hacks, you end up discovering that something like 5.6% of people in that country invented in one fashion or another, either creating something completely from scratch or sort of hacking something. Now, von Hippel sort of suggests that we take this pretty seriously because occasionally really big things come from this. Now, I realize you all are New Yorkers, but I assume that sometimes you fly to the West Coast, and in flyover country, some of the things that we occasionally see are these amazing circles. And these circles are the product of a very specific form of irrigation. It's called center pivot irrigation. And basically, the reason that you're capable of farming in a place like Nebraska or Colorado is because of this. You take a field, you drill a well in the center of it, and you spin this machine around it, which is capable of moving on an electric motor, watering everything in its path, and it basically makes it feasible to farm country that was completely unfeasible to farm. This was invented by a farmer in western Nebraska in 1949 who basically got pissed off at moving sprinklers all the time and figured that this was just a better way to do it and literally put it together without the motor and was sort of dragging it around and then figured out how to get a motor on it. This is now a 2.6, no, I'm sorry, it's even bigger than that. It's more like a $5 or $6 billion industry worldwide. The largest player has a market cap of 2.6 billion. So this is something literally hacked together by a farmer to try to figure out how to make his life slightly easier that has turned into basically an agricultural revolution, at least in this country and throughout much of the world. So I want to speak basically in defense of incremental innovation. And what I mean by that is there's at least two ways to think through innovation and invention. One is the sort of big lab stuff that we're used to paying attention to. 10 years in the lab, we found things that we thought were only possible in science fiction books. In truth, an enormous amount of innovation takes place from people making small improvements on whatever surrounds them. And in some cases, that innovation may actually be more appropriate, easier to roll out, and in the long run may have more impact than the revolutionary stuff. So just an example of two projects that I found myself involved with. I do a lot of work in the developing world, particularly around technology, and I've ended up advising both of these projects, and they're about as different as you can get. The one on the right, you all know, it's one laptop per child. It's this incredibly exciting $100 laptop. It's been recreated from the ground up, completely new monitor technology, radical power use design to make sure there's an extremely efficient processor, designed to make it possible for every child in the world to have a computer for under $100. Amazing project. If it happens on a broad scale, incredible revolution, changes how we think about education altogether. On the left is a project that none of you have probably heard about. It's called Moulin, and it's basically a very simple system to take the French language Wikipedia and bring it offline. And the reason for this is that the guys who were working on this were working for me in Bamako, Mali, and we're trying to figure out how to use some of these donated used computers for educational purposes. They couldn't get on the internet, far too expensive, the computers were far too old for it, but they had CD-ROM drives. And so the question became, could you squeeze all of Wikipedia onto a CD-ROM drive? And the answer is you can, and you can build this really interesting reader that compresses files, and you can make it possible for school kids who have donated equipment to have access to this amazing educational resource. Now, Moulin is not going to change the world, but it is going to change the world in a small way. And the nice thing about it is that it takes advantage of what's already there. It takes advantage of these donated computers. It's very easy to deploy. And in the process of deploying something like Moulin, you actually learn an enormous amount that you could probably apply to something as big as one laptop per child and probably increase the chances that that project is going to succeed. So what I want to suggest is not that revolutionary tech is a bad thing. I'm a huge fan of it, and I think we should be doing it. I do think that teaching people how to innovate from the revolutionary paradigm is a disaster. And I say this as a failed art student. And this screen is why I failed as an art student. This screen is just a manifestation of a problem that failed artists have had since the dawn of time, which is the blank canvas. I will be standing by for further announcements. In the meantime, I will try to explain to you why this forced me to fail out of grad school. The problem with revolutionary innovation is that when you clear the fields and you say anything is possible, you have nowhere to start. There's nothing to build on top of. My limited success as an artist came from literally raiding junkyards and finding junk that I could refashion into musical instruments. And what was great about it is that there's really only so many ways that you can take apart an engine block and try to turn it into percussion. But if you're starting literally with the ability to do anything, you often end up in a situation where you can't do anything. And so what I want to suggest is, in addition to revolutionary innovation, that there's great ways to look for sort of incremental and constrained innovation. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, you see this all over the place in the developing world. So just shout out when you can figure out what these kids are doing. There we go. That's awfully good. Most people don't get it on the second slide. So these kids are in an orphanage in Kenya, and they're putting together what's probably the most popular toy in the world, the football. And they're putting together a football based on used carrier bags and a little bit of twine. And you see an amazing diversity in design in these things throughout the developing world. My favorite ones actually have a string hanging off of them, and they're really useful if you want to learn how to hack. So you never lose the ball. It actually stays pretty close to hand while you're working out all your tricks. But one way or another, an enormous amount of football is played with these homemade balls, and there's a whole technique to how to get it right and which bags to use and when. But what's basically going on is that you're seeing kids taking something that exists in their environment, that would be waste in their environment, and turning it into something that they need. And you see examples of this all throughout the developing world. This is a fisherman in Lamu, Kenya. And I don't know if you guys can see this, but these are water bottles. Lots and lots and lots of water bottles. And the reason that he has lots and lots of water bottles is that Lamu is an amazing beach town. It's just gorgeous. And tourists come there and they don't want to drink the water, so they're drinking bottled water. And it's really hot, so you might drink 3 or 4 liters while you're sitting out there. And he goes every morning, he picks up the water bottles, and he's put it together into this sort of astounding lightweight boat. It's a very different design than most boats, which require a team of 5 or 10 people to carry a carved out log out into the water with you. He's got a boat that he can both live in and fish in by himself because it's light enough that he's capable of carrying it. And it's a great object lesson in sort of the first rule of innovating from constraint, which is to use what you have, not what you lack. The second rule is that what you end up using is what's most familiar to you. When I hang out in the developing world, I am always amazed at the two things that get hacked the most often. For years and years and years, the thing that got hacked the most often was the bicycle. And it's simply because it's incredibly pervasive. It's far more common than the motor vehicle. People use it for all sorts of purposes, and they hack it into amazing contraptions. So this is an ambulance. If you're trying to get someone from a village in Namibia into a larger city, you want to make sure that they're secure, that they're at least semi-reclining, but you may be on roads that you can't take a vehicle on, and it may be impossibly long to wait for a vehicle to come, so you end up with a bicycle ambulance. You also end up with payphones. And these were more common a couple years back before the mobile phone became truly pervasive. But this was a wireless phone that had a power supply attached to it, and someone would literally bring it on their bike to wherever people needed to make calls, would collect the money, would move on from there. This is sort of the merger of the two most hackable African technologies, which is the bicycle and the mobile phone. The mobile phone is hacked to an incredible degree in sub-Saharan Africa. People hack them to put multiple SIM cards in them, so you're on different networks. They hack them to power them in wonderful ways. This is someone who's wired a way to take a little dynamo that rides on his bicycle and use it to charge his mobile phone. And the dynamo turns out to be the key piece of pervasive technology. Remember, pervasive is hackable. Technologies that are easy to find that enables this windmill to get built. Now, this windmill is built by a guy named William Kamkwamba in extremely rural Mali, much more rural than anything we've talked about before. This guy is, 15 miles away from the nearest village that has a formal school. And his family is desperately, desperately poor. They're so poor that this kid can't go to school, can't pay the school fees. And he ends up as an unemployed teenager in a country that's going through a famine, obsessed with the radio. He desperately wants to play the radio because he wants to dance with his friends. And the main constraint on this, he's got a radio, he just doesn't have batteries. There's no possible way to afford them. So he starts raiding garbage dumps, and he ends up finding an old bicycle, pieces of PVC for the blades, and he finally scrapes up enough money to buy a dynamo. Puts it together, is able to wire his house for electric lights, for multiple radios. He ends up literally building switches out of things like PVC conduit and little pieces of sandal so that they'll be insulators, so you can have those old push-button switches, if anyone remembers. They turn out to be lots easier to build than the toggle switches. So William's an amazing story because he gets to tell this story on stage in Arusha, Tanzania, in front of TED. He ends up getting a scholarship to a leading private school. He's become a very successful author on this. He's a very dramatic example of this. But there are examples all throughout the developing world of ways in which constraint leads to creativity. When you can't go down to the electric store and buy a switch, you start finding ways to put things together in ways that no one else has ever thought of. Finally, within looking at this, the problems to solve are really hard to see when you're not on the ground. This is my office about 10 years ago in Ghana. And that enormous stack of bills is weekly payroll for the 7 people that I have on staff. And the reason for this is at that point, the Ghanaian currency was so devalued that one bill was worth a little bit less than $1. If you wanted to buy a car in Ghana, you would generally ask me to help you because I'm really big, and you would have to carry 2 carrier bags full of cash to hand over and find a way to buy a car because there's no checking system and no credit system. You spend a while in this environment, and things like mobile money make incredible intuitive sense. They're absolutely the thing you should do, absolutely the thing you should work on. But it's very hard to see in the US, for instance, where mobile money has taken a long time to catch on, because we've all got credit cards and we have a functioning checking system, why this would be one of the more compelling things to do. So I'm offering these basic theories. Work with what you have, look at what's pervasive and figure out how to hack it. Don't presume that you know the problem. And then if you take advantage of this, there are ways in which these good ideas can spread. So this brings us to Tunisia. I suspect everyone here is following the events of the Arab Spring, trying to figure out what's going to happen. I am happy to put the political science disclaimer that I have no idea what's going to happen in the long run. But I now, at this point, understand what happened in Tunisia well enough, mostly because I hang out with a lot of Tunisians, that I think I can unpack it for you. And I think it actually ties back to those lessons. If you want to think about how crazy it is that this revolution is sweeping North Africa, what you really need to think about is how this guy, Mohammed Bouazizi, and this little town of Sidi Bouzid ended up sparking this revolt. And just to give you a sense of how small Sidi Bouzid is, I actually had to find a map and put it on the map, because it literally isn't on most maps of Tunisia. Sidi Bouzid is this dusty little town in the center of Tunisia. You would never go there as a tourist. It's got 40,000 people. It's completely isolated from the rest of the country. And this guy, Mohammed Bouazizi, got pissed off about having his vegetables confiscated, didn't have a formal job, was illegally, informally selling vegetables, got furious, understandably, and then probably less understandably set himself on fire. As we try to figure out what happened in Tunisia, it's worth noting that he was not the first Tunisian to set himself on fire in protest of unemployment. He wasn't even the first vegetable seller to set himself on fire. He wasn't even the first vegetable seller in 2010 to set himself on fire. And you start seeing sites like this one appear on Facebook. They're specifically focused on Sidi Bouzid. This in Arabic says something roughly, Sidi Bouzid as the turning point. But these are sites very much pitched to other Tunisians, at most. They're really hard to find. Unless you know where they are, they're really hard to find on Facebook. And keep in mind, Facebook is designed to be a personal social network. Generally speaking, you know about 150 people on Facebook. I'm sure you're all very popular and you know more, but the mean number on the system is about 150. These are not easy to gain access to. And this by itself probably would not have spread the protest beyond Sidi Bouzid because the city has been completely cordoned off by the police. There's no media in there. There's no info getting in and out other than online. The second thing you get is dissident media, sites like this one, Nawat, which are trying to find ways to document what's going on in Sidi Bouzid. These are run by Tunisian dissidents. They're not in the country, but they speak Tunisian, which is not Arabic. It's sort of Arabic plus French plus Italian plus half a dozen other things, and it's totally incomprehensible if you don't speak those other languages. So they're able to go figure out what's being said on Tunisian Facebook pages, put it into standard Arabic and French, and put it together for folks like Al Jazeera. Now, Jazeera has never been in Tunisia. Ben Ali never allowed the network in there. And Jazeera, if you know anything about them, ends up with a real chip on their shoulder when they're banned from a country. And so they ended up with an enormous amount of passion for publishing this stuff. When this stuff ended up on Jazeera, it ended up mirrored back into the country. So people who never would have known about the protests because they weren't following individuals in Sidi Bouzid saw it only once it hit Jazeera, which is watched incredibly widely in Tunisia, even if they can't report within Tunisia. So what really happened here was sort of an ecosystem approach. And my guess is that a lot of you have seen that image on the left. The photographer who took that image in her Flickr set directly after that is this other one that says, "Thank you, Al Jazeera." And this is basically a recognition that what went on in Tunisia, and to a lesser extent in Egypt, was finding ways to use Facebook to get local reporting and to get it out onto a network like Jazeera. Now, I want to talk a little bit about constraint, right? Facebook is a terrible, terrible tool for activists. When I sit down and brief activists around the world on what to use, we have a 30-minute session on why you shouldn't use Facebook. But the trick, and it's awful. The real name requirement is absolutely miserable. You can't index your content. You can't tag it. It's not searchable. It's not findable. It's utterly miserable. But in Tunisia, it was the only thing you could use. The Tunisian government had shut down YouTube. They'd shut down Dailymotion. They'd shut down Vimeo. There was no other platform where you could post video. The only reason they hadn't shut down Facebook is when they tried to do it in 2008, more people came to Facebook. They figured out how to get around the firewall, and they flocked onto Facebook, and the population of Tunisians using Facebook quadrupled in the week that they were blocking it. So they were terrified of blocking it. So Facebook was all that they had, and they tried to figure out how to develop on top of it, and that's where these sites like Nawat start becoming very helpful in trying to figure out how to aggregate it. Now, there's a phenomenon associated with platforms like Facebook that I like to call the cute cat theory. And the cute cat theory basically says that if you're a political activist, you don't want to use tools that are explicitly activist tools. It's very easy for a government to shut down protestar.com, right? Because the only people who give a damn about it are fellow protesters. But if you shut down the platform where people are looking at cute videos of cats, then they get really pissed off. And in fact, people who might not have been interested in your political content want to know, why is it that I can't see the cute cats anymore? So one of the incentives for activists is to try to figure out how to use these cute cat platforms. Platforms that are completely innocuous on the surface, but end up being very politically powerful behind the scenes. One of the great things about these platforms is that they're incredibly pervasive. And it was the pervasiveness, not just of Facebook, which was used by about 19% of Tunisians, but particularly of TV, that made it so powerful for this to spread. All throughout the Arab world, you have cafes where people are sitting and watching television. And what happened in Tunisia is that the police would literally come over to cafe owners and beg them to turn off Jazeera and put on something else, because they realized that this information on the protests ending up on Jazeera was having this mobilizing effect. For something to really spread, for these little innovations to really, really spread, you have to find a way to have it be on a platform that a lot of people have access to. And while the internet is not universal in the Arab world, television most certainly is, and particularly satellite television. So finally within this, you had lots and lots of people from the West, really nice, well-meaning folks, doing really dumb stuff. And so one example of a well-meaning but really dumb idea was the idea that we would somehow use open mesh networks. We would hack our routers to create a cloud of connectivity that would magically bring Egypt back online. The tricky thing is, if you actually talk to Egyptians about what they wanted, they had small ways to get connectivity out of the country. They had access to the one remaining ISP. They were calling people in Jordan and sending information. They were sending reports over phone calls. What they wanted was amplification. But what happens in many cases is that we look from the outside and we see what we think the problem is. Oh no, they've shut off the internet in Egypt. And we look for a solution which may be wholly inappropriate, may not be able to be rolled out, but we're choosing it basically because we're thinking about the wrong problem. Again, when you're thinking about activism, the key is to figure out, how do you leverage what you have? How do you build on these pervasive platforms like a Facebook, like TV, even if you don't like them? Because if you get it right, and if you don't presume that you have the answer to the problem, you have the possibility that these good ideas will spread. So where does this take us? I think one of the keys to understand is that we're missing the real story in Tunisia and in Egypt. Revolutions are, the charismatic megafauna of politics, right? I mean, if you're the World Wildlife Fund, you come up with polar bears or you come up with lions under threat or something like that. They're very attractive, they're very big, everyone pays attention to it. But the really interesting stuff is the indicator species, right? It's a roundworm or it's a fungus or something along those lines. Stop looking at the lion, look at the fungus. What's really interesting and where the real innovation is happening in a country like Egypt right now is in meetings like this one. This is a meeting in Tunisia. This is in 2008. And this was a banned political meeting associated with WISIS. And when you saw people actually taking to the streets, it was often based around cores like this who've been arguing about these issues for years and years and years. The future of a country like Egypt or a country like Tunisia is going to come from what happens in these meetings. It's hard to see because it doesn't look like an innovation. But having people in a country like Egypt or Tunisia get together and discuss with different people what sort of government they want, that's really revolutionary. So, thank you.